Allow me to introduce our truly distinguished speaker tonight, Dr. Tom Fisher. Professor Fisher is professor in the School of Architecture, the Dayton Hudson Chair in Urban Design at the University of Minnesota, and director of the Metropolitan Design Center at the College of Design at the University of Minnesota. A graduate of Cornell University in Architecture and Case Western Reserve University in Intellectual History, Dr. Fisher was recognized in 2005 as the fifth most published writer about architecture in the United States. Named a top 25 design educator 4 times by Design Intelligence, he has lectured at 36 universities and over 150 professional and public meetings in the U.S. He has written extensively about architectural design, practice, and ethics, and is the author of several books, and his newest book, Designing Our Way to a Better World, is scheduled to be published this spring. Dr. Fisher is a strong proponent of geodesign, which combines spatial thinking and GIS with design thinking to help us create a more resilient and thriving future. Dr. Fisher's current research involves looking at the implications of the third industrial revolution on architecture and cities in the 21st century. Dr. Fisher is visiting Redlands this week to lead and moderate conversations at Esri's Geodesign Summit, and very graciously accepted our invitation to come and speak at tonight's event. So it is truly again a privilege and a pleasure to introduce Professor Tom Fisher. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to him.
I want to make the case, I think it's pretty evident that we are in an unprecedented moment in human history. So it took all of our species' history to about 2010 to reach 50% of us being urbanized. In 1950, just 30% of the human population was urbanized. 60 years later, we crossed the 50% boundary, and by 2014, we're at 54% of the population being urbanized. And by 2050, we will be, by many estimates, around 66% urbanized. So in other words, in a mere 100 years of the entire history of our species, we will have more than doubled the number of humans living in cities. I mean, this is an extraordinary change for us. We are averaging an increase of about 71 million people per year moving into cities. In the U.S., I think we often don't realize that 82% of us are now living in cities. We are essentially an urban country. I find it fascinating that this almost never comes up in the current political debates. In fact, the only mentions of cities that I've heard is when Donald Trump says that he could fire a pistol down Fifth Avenue and not kill any of his supporters, as if somehow the only thing to talk about with cities is who you can shoot, when in fact 82% of us are living in urban areas. Meanwhile, the global rural population is on a steady decline. Even though we're growing as a species in terms of numbers, we will see a decline from 3.4 billion to, by some estimates, about 3.2 billion people by 2050. This infographic shows the pace of that increase, and of course, as you can see, China and India are contributing greatly to that increase, although certainly the U.S. is a contributor as well. Now, geographers, of course, have talked about many of the reasons that this is happening, and in many ways it differs with every country. I mean, we know in China that there's been a urbanization policy. They are, within a matter of a couple decades, moving the equivalent of the entire U.S. population into cities. That there would be about 300 million Chinese moving from rural areas to cities within a matter of a few decades. Extraordinary change. We're seeing in countries like India, population pressures leading people to move to cities. In other parts of the world, there's civil unrest in rural areas, which is leading people to move into cities. But I want to make a larger point, because one of the things that this data shows is that this is happening in rich and poor nations alike. This is not something that is simply about the developing world becoming more developed. This is happening in stable countries as well as unstable ones. And so I want to make an argument that there is a larger force going on that is leading our species to do this. And I make the case that there are really two forces I at least want to talk about. There are probably others, environmental and economic. And on the environmental front, I want to make the case that what we are doing is what Elizabeth Colbert, the biologist who wrote the recent book, The Sixth Extinction, has noted that species do when they are threatened by a loss of the ecosystems that support them. One of the things that biologists recognize is that species do not disperse when their ecosystem is threatened. They actually gather. They gather together in those few ecosystems that can still support them. And I want to make a case that that's exactly what we are doing right now. That we have so disrupted the ecosystems on which humanity depends that we are gathering together in cities, which is the ecosystem that we have the greatest control over and the one that can most sustain us. Some of this comes, the fact of we've been doing so much disruption because, as I argued in my last book, we have had a Ponzi scheme with the planet for the last couple hundred years. Some of you may remember Bernard Madoff's economic Ponzi scheme. And this infographic explains it, I think, pretty well. And but we have been doing this to the planet. In other words, we've been exploiting other species and exploiting other people, and primarily, interestingly enough, future generations to keep us enriched and consuming at the level that we're consuming. And there were two lessons that I drew in my last book about Madoff, which is one of the things he recognized is if the Ponzi scheme is big enough, nobody sees it. And then if it's big enough, the second thing is that so many people are investing in it, nobody wants to see it. They basically ignore it. And I want to make the argument that that's what has been happening with our economy, is that we have developed an exploitative Ponzi-like economy that is so big and we have so much invested in it that we don't recognize it, and we do not want to acknowledge that we are off the planet. So one of the things about Ponzi schemes is that they work well as long as you can keep exploiting others. And they collapse suddenly when they no longer have anybody to exploit. Bernard Madoff quite literally ran out of human beings on the planet. And his Ponzi scheme collapsed, as they always do, by the way. Ponzi schemes always collapse. And so one of the problems we have is it now takes about 1.5 planets to support us at our current level of consumption. Another way to think about this is that many environmentalists think that somewhere around September, we totally utilize and use up the annual carrying capacity of our planet. And so, as this diagram shows, we're at this kind of turning point in the history of our species. We either change what we do and how we live, or we are headed to the collapse of the civilization upon which we have all come to depend. Now, I know all of that sounds rather doom and gloom. And in fact, my last book came out and people said, wow, is that depressing? And they said, can't you write something more optimistic, which is the topic of my next book and most of the topic of this talk. So I also want to argue that humanity is doing things right now that is changing this curve. It is part of the new economy that is emerging. And I'm quite hopeful about it. But I think there's also no question that if we do not change, we will find ourselves forced to change simply by the changing climate that we are exposing ourselves to. I mean, there are many people in Minnesota who like climate change because we're having mild winters and less snow. But as you know, in Southern California, climate change has lots of downsides, but the main piece of it is it's just incredibly disruptive. It's extreme in almost every way. This question is, are cities in some ways a survival mechanism for our species? And I think the answer, as always, for these kinds of questions is it depends. When you begin to do the GIS analysis, you begin to see that we have, this is, by the way, a map of the carbon footprint of every county and municipality, I believe, in the U.S. And you'll note this kind of Swiss cheese quality about it. And what that really shows is that cities have a much lower carbon footprint than suburbs. And so the little green dots are where the built-up city is. The red surrounding those green holes are suburbs. And so it does suggest that density is a piece of this puzzle. In fact, one of the things that's interesting about these data is that whatever the urban cores are achieving in terms of reducing carbon footprints, they're being canceled out by suburbs. But when you even dive in a little closer, it really suggests, as you'll see here with New York, how we actually can achieve in cities a pretty low carbon footprint, a pretty low ecological footprint, at least in the more urban areas of cities like New York. Since 1950s, since World War II, we've developed a development pattern that has really allowed the development community to build extraordinary amounts of infrastructure, bury the cost of the infrastructure in the sale price of the houses they sell, hand all that infrastructure over to the cities, the municipalities, which works fine as long as that infrastructure is in good shape. When it comes time to replace that infrastructure, the cities realize they have nowhere near the tax base to support the infrastructure that they inherited. And what's, I think, significant about that is we didn't used to build cities this way. We used to be much more incremental and careful about the amount of infrastructure we put in place. That's a whole other Ponzi scheme. But what this shows is that the built-up parts of our cities are, in fact, heavily subsidizing suburbs. It's the inverse of what we tend to think of. We tend to think of the core cities as poor and the suburbs as rich. In fact, when you look at municipal finance, it's absolutely the reverse. In any event, but this goes beyond density. I think research shows that our ecological footprint depends much more on how much we consume than on where we live. And so really, and one another way to think about the world, and I have colleagues in geography who really talk about the world this way. It's divided up between the fat and the thin nations. Of course, we, as you can see in this little diagram, are one of the fat nations. And so it's not really necessarily an urban versus suburban or rural issue that I'm talking about. I mean, a rural family that, for example, grows its own food, makes its own clothes, it can have a much smaller footprint than an urban family that has to buy everything. But assuming most of us don't want to live like the Amish, it turns out that cities really have, I think, the greatest potential to reduce our collective ecological footprint. And in that way, the fact that we are rapidly urbanizing is, whether we're conscious of it or not, is a survival sort of response and method and mechanism for us. And so that brings me to the next part of my talk, which is talking about the collaborative sharing on-demand economy that is really emerging in cities right now. This is not something that is going to happen in the future. It is, in fact, one of the fastest growing parts of our economy. I am sometimes frustrated by my media colleagues who do not, I think, give this nearly enough attention. We tend to still be obsessed by the Fortune 500 and by large corporations. And yet, I think when you look at the history of large corporations, they actually have relatively short lives. And I think that part of what is needed, and certainly I know this is being discussed in business schools, is recognizing the sort of kind of radical transformation that is coming with this economy. When you begin to look at a landscape, again, another infographic around it, and you look at some of the sectors, so we're all aware of Uber and Lyft, what's happening in the transportation sector, Airbnb and home away, the impact that that's been having in housing and in hospitality. Finance with Lending Club and Prosper, even in solar energy with Solar City. And I think what's also striking about many of these examples is how rapidly they are growing. And so I would argue that this is one of the ways in which we squeeze out all of the incredible inefficiency in our system. That not only are we urbanizing, but we are figuring out how to urbanize in this ecosystem in a way that makes us much more efficient and effective. This is, of course, also becoming a global phenomenon. This is just off of Airbnb's website, just to show how it is really spreading around the globe. The geography of this is quite remarkable. There are several drivers to this new economy, and some of these diagrams come out of some group which the Collaborative Lab is what I see it says there. But in any event, it's been fairly widely published in the business press and magazines like Fast Company. The argument that some of the research that's been going on shows that there's at least 4 drivers. Obviously, one is technology, and the fact of mobile computing certainly helping this, as well as 3D printing and other technologies. But there's also a values shift that the research is beginning to show. This idea that we are moving into an economy where everybody is both a producer as well as a consumer. And where networks have a much stronger pull and greater power than hierarchies. This, of course, is having an enormous impact on the way existing businesses organize themselves. There's, of course, an economic driver, which is that nimbleness seems to have an advantage over size, and that design is a differentiator more so than performance or price. And then finally, there's this environmental side to it, which is the notion that we have recognized that we are probably in a time where we're going to have to be shipping bytes more than bodies, and that instead of making things halfway around the world and shipping them here, that we are entering a time where, in fact, we're moving into a mass customization economy in which we will be making things much more locally and in a mass customized way. This is, by some accounts, a collaborative consumption economy, which is based on sharing or renting products and services rather than owning. And so some of the recent data shows that it's about a $335 billion economy. We are beginning to also see evidence of this all around us. In my city, Minneapolis, there's just an incredible amount of rental housing that's being built. I mean, one of the things, of course, that's driving this is that the 2 largest demographics, which are millennials and baby boomers, are both wanting to live in cities in rental housing. But certainly when I talk to my students, the movement away from ownership to access is a really striking phenomenon. I've recently, in fact, asked my students, would they rather have a car or a smartphone? Every single one of them said they would rather have a smartphone because they recognize that this is a transportation mechanism. This is a device to get not only movement and transportation, but almost everything else. And so these are major shifts in the way we think about our economy. The old economy was based on competition. The new one is much more based on who are your partners, who are your collaborators. And so finding businesses that, in fact, are thriving when they build the strongest networks is, I think, another characteristic of this economy. It's a sharing economy. It's about renting out underutilized assets, that extra bedroom, that extra seat in your car, that underused gear. And this really raises the question about the impact that we've been having on the planet. I think one of the things that, to me, this economy shows is that we have far too much stuff that is underutilized. We own cars that sit parked for over 90% of their time. We have buildings that are heated and lit and yet are used, maybe office buildings may be used 10 hours a day and then they sit empty. Meanwhile, we have homelessness problems. We have, affordable housing problems. And what the new economy asks of us is to say, what are our assets, what are our needs, and how do we begin to rethink all of the excess capacity that we have in our economy as a result of the overproduction of goods and services over the last couple centuries is part of, I think, the message here for us. Now, I have some of my business school colleagues, see that as, well, how are we going to make things? How are we going to, make profits? I think my argument back is that there's tremendous opportunity in this economy, like any economy, that the ability to use resources more effectively and to wring waste out of the system is itself a tremendous advantage and opportunity for business. This is a peer economy. It's, as I said, a lot of it is based on local production and global sales. I had colleagues who recently did some research in rural Texas, and they literally went door to door in small towns and asked people how they made their living. And it was over 50% made their living online. They were making things, they were providing services globally from small towns in rural Texas. And so there's much more of this activity than I think we're always aware. And I think that another aspect of this peer economy is the power of peer evaluation. I have some colleagues who have been studying this in New York, and they're finding that you can close a bad restaurant down faster through bad peer reviews than the government can come and do a review of it and close it down for safety and health inspections. In other words, the peer economy is even a more efficient regulatory mechanism than the government. So this raises questions about government regulation and its nature. Of course, for those of you who are interested in marketing, of course, this is also the power of a new form of marketing, which is really changing the way we think about how we send messages out. Also, I find the rise of collaborative finance, micro-lending and micro-investing fascinating, which suggests that this is also an economy that levels the playing field in many ways. The old economies, you had to have a lot of capital. You had to have no people who had access to capital. It was about amassing enough money to begin a business. One of the characteristics that I think is fascinating about this economy is that you can microfinance your way into businesses in a way that was never really much possible before. And so I think, images like this on the cover of The Economist sort of captures the fact that this economy is transforming the world we live in, and that so to me, the really interesting question is, will we continue to live this way, or will we in fact begin to live and work in different kinds of ways? And I'll talk about that in a minute. Just a little bit more data about this. This is some research that was done about the sharing economy in the US, UK, and Canada. And as you can see, it's actually about a quarter of the economy is what they call neo-sharers, which is an odd term that they use, but basically these are people who are heavily into the sharing economy. And what's also, I think, interesting about that is the demographics, which, as you might expect, although it's sort of equally shared between men and women, it's very much an economy of youth. And so almost half of the millennial generation is pretty actively involved in this economy. It's also an urban phenomenon. Now, there's some debate about whether that's just the fact that there are more young people who live in cities, but nevertheless, it's also, I think, connected to this rapid urbanization that we're seeing, because one of the characteristics about a sharing economy is that proximity matters. If you're going to be sharing something, it helps greatly to be close to people. And so another aspect of this economy, which connects to GIS, is that it is a profoundly geolocational economy. It matters where you are. And finding things to share is of profound importance. And so next I want to talk again about a little bit more about this idea of how the world itself may be different as a result of this economy. And for this, I've been quite interested in the work of Jeremy Rifkin. You may know his book, The Third Industrial Revolution. And there have been others who have been writing about this as well. I mean, he makes the argument that in addition to this new economy, that one way to think about it is we're moving into what he calls a third industrial revolution. And the point here is that computing is an essential piece of this new economy, but you don't have an industrial revolution until you start to make things differently. And what's happened recently is we're starting to make things in new ways, not just interact and share information in new ways. As Rifkin and a growing number of economists have argued, is that this economy is in its death throes. This is an economy that is not only unsustainable environmentally, it is leading to too much inequality, and it is, as I said earlier, a kind of Ponzi scheme that is quite vulnerable to catastrophic failure. And so what do we do about this? If the first industrial revolution began with the steam engine, a vehicle, second began with Henry Ford's Model T, I make an argument that this may be one of the signal vehicles for the third industrial revolution. This is the first 3D printed working car. And think about that. Instead of owning a large factory, an enormous corporation, you can now hit the print button and print yourself a car. And this is how revolutions happen. It's not like you have to do what Marx said and create a war and have lots of conflict. You can innovate yourself into a revolution where there is no way that GM and Ford can compete with this. So and of course, GM and Ford know this. I'll maybe talk in a little bit, but they are quickly doing research onto how they're going to change their business model because of their awareness of this phenomenon. And one of the things that they are doing, for example, is beginning to think of themselves as mobility service companies rather than car manufacturers. So some other outgrowths of this new economy are the solidarity economy. We're beginning to map these new ways in which social media is connecting people to opportunities. This is a group called Solidarity New York City, which is through open source networks, the production and exchange of goods and services much easier for the residents of that city. We're also seeing things like Find Coop, which is a directory of alternative economic activities, and the Data Commons Cooperative, which is really made up of organizations who are really trying to rebuild a kind of cooperative set of business models for organizations that believe in sharing information not only with each other and with their members, but in an open source way with the general public. I think we're also seeing a shift in this economy from a kind of resource-based notion of wealth to an asset-based notion of wealth, recognizing that the greatest wealth in any community are its people and its social networks. And so we're shifting away from resource and extraction to innovation and creativity. and helping everybody be productive. There are even these new models that are emerging. This is a model that has emerged in Cleveland where instead of a kind of trickle-down way of thinking about economic development, it focuses on inclusion and building local economies from the ground up. So instead of offering public subsidies to induce corporations to offer low-wage jobs to communities, what it does is it catalyzes new businesses owned by the employees, and it doesn't so much focus on workforce training as it first creates the job and then recruits and trains the local residents to fill them. So this is an example of local economies emerging out of this sharing collaborative economy that is transforming cities that have struggled in the old economy. It's, as I said, a access economy, and of course this, when you begin to look at the extent to which investors are supporting it, you can recognize the appeal of it. It also, I think, is going to transform how we live and how we have our needs met. We're also beginning to see how cities are starting to ask questions about this. This was this cover of a really interesting report that came out from the National League of Cities recently. And again, as I mentioned with regulation, the new economy begins to upend a lot of the assumptions on the public sector as well. And so some of the questions this report asks, for example, is can cities capture revenue without creating unnecessary burdens? In other words, I think one of the challenges of this economy is how do we ensure public safety and yet not stifle innovation and sort of new ventures in this economy? What does the sharing economy mean in terms of job creation? I think another issue here is what does it mean to have what increasingly economists are calling the gig economy, and where you do not have a traditional employment relationship, but you're moving from various opportunities and actually holding several jobs at once. What are the implications of that for healthcare and benefits? I mean, there are a lot of assumptions that are built into the public sector that this economy begins to challenge. What does it mean in terms of affordable housing? One of the critiques of Robert Reich is that what he's seeing in San Francisco is, in fact, it's the benefit of landlords to turn their affordable housing into Airbnbs. And so where they're seeing a dramatic drop in affordable housing. And so I think, have to recognize that there are a lot of shifts that have to happen in terms of how we think about these economic shifts and these changes, and begin to rethink the role that the government needs to play. There's a lot of conversation in this report about access and equity, things like insurance. How do we ensure safety? How do we ensure building codes in places like Airbnb? And so, my view of this is that this is happening. We should not be Pollyannish about it, and recognize that, like any economic transformation, there will need to be a period of time when we are trying to develop new legal and regulatory mechanisms to accommodate it. But the idea that it's happening, I think there's no question. One of the things that some of my work has been is also looking at what will cities be like. And interestingly enough, one of the things that strikes me is how much the implications of this lead us back to an older way of thinking about urbanism. This is an image from an interesting group in Europe. They're called the Unmonastery. And they're not religious-based at all, but what they recognized is that monastic communities were sort of the ultimate and very early sustainable community. And it's a place-based social innovation NGO that is looking at utilizing empty space, unemployed individuals, and depleted social services to rethink the way in which communities can thrive and provide services that their population needs. I'm involved with a couple other groups nationally who are working on the idea that we have on this idea of an asset economy, about 10,000 people on average retiring every day. And that will happen, that will continue. It's gone on for the last 5 years and will continue for the next 19. And an amazing statistic is that recently I came upon that half of all the people who are over 65 ever in the history of our species are alive today. And so we have this tremendous asset of individuals, not only unemployed and underemployed individuals whose the school system has failed to recognize their intelligence and their capabilities, but we also have a very large aging population that has tremendous asset and knowledge and experience to offer. And so rethinking the ways in which we employ everybody in a community is, I think, part of the goal of thinking about how we accommodate this new economy. So let me just also end by saying a little bit about geodesign, which is partly why I have such a hoarse voice and talking about it for so much today. But geodesign, for me, is really the marrying of the kind of analytic power of GIS, which, as I said earlier, is becoming maybe the fundamental skill set in a geolocational economy. The sharing economy, if you do not have those spatial locational skills, it will be hard to operate in this new economy. It's great that your business school offers that, and you're rather unique in that regard. And so that's a great advantage you have here at the University of Redlands. But it's marrying that analytical power of GIS with the way in which, at least I think about design, and increasingly other people are thinking about it, which is design is really about envisioning possible futures. It's about envisioning something that doesn't yet exist. I mean, when Steve Jobs designed and developed the smartphone, you know, he was not commissioned for that. I mean, he envisioned something that we didn't know we needed until he came out with it, and we recognized how valuable it was. And to me, that's where design is at its best. It's looking at a need and meeting that need in innovative, creative new ways. And so bringing these two very powerful ways of thinking of geographic information systems and the sort of innovation capacity of design is, I think, it makes it also one of the most valuable tools. So let me just end. This is the cover of my new book where I talk about a lot of these issues. And I just want to leave you with the idea that I think that we are in an incredible moment in human history. This may be one of the amazing periods of time to be alive in, maybe equivalent to the kind of transformation that happened with the Renaissance the last time. We had a big change in medium, as Marshall McLuhan said. The medium's the message. The book transformed civilization in profound ways, brought on the Industrial Revolution, the Protestant Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, and increasingly I think we're recognizing that this change in medium will have an equally powerful and transformative effect on human civilization.